wasn't the first one to cut the lock on the bus barn. That honor belongs to a kid named Rafe. Back when the sheriff's car still made slow loops past the fairgrounds and everyone pretended not to look at the building leaning behind the live oak. I was 12 then. I'm 49 now, a father, and I know better than to break locks. But I also know the lock on the bus barn has never once kept anyone out. People in Goliad don't take padlocks as orders. We take them like reminders that some doors have to be held closed by a person and not a piece of metal, and the person got tired. The bus barn was a long, low shed of corrugated tin that the heat turned into a breathing animal. It crouched a little away from the dirt road, half buried in wild sunflowers with a breeze that always smelled like warm pennies and grass clippings. Cicadas flared up and died down in the trees like a busted electrical line. The concrete pad out front where the buses used to idle had soft, buckled places with weeds pushing through the cracks as if the ground wanted to swallow everything rubber and yellow and done with itself. There was a creek 50 yards behind it. Anyone raised here knows that creek, how it goes lazy in the summer, how it drops off quick on the side so you can go from inches to a sudden dunk. The old-timers tell you the creek has moods. We all say it like a joke. Then you follow the bank one evening and the air goes stale and sweet with algae, and the joke doesn't land anymore. The evenings after the bus went missing, people said they heard children by the water. Not words, just laughter that didn't float the way sound floats. The laughter lay down in the grass and stayed there, even when there wasn't any wind to push it around. In 1978, Bus 7 left the barn on a Tuesday afternoon and didn't come back. That's the stub of it, worn down by decades of retelling. Folks have polished it into a pure story. There was a driver named Alma. There were 4 stops left on the route. There was a heat wave. There was a tire found flat and warm. There were scrapings of yellow paint on a low bridge. There were 31 parents who lined the highway like fence posts as dusk came down, and the sheriff kept saying the same thing. We'll bring them home. The sheriff is dead now. He was a man who believed in locks. It's funny what stays in a town. The old post office becomes a feed store. The feed store becomes a vape shop. The name of the driver stays Alma in every throat. The bus barn stays. Bus 7 does not. People moved away. People moved back. The barn leaned a little farther every year, and the padlock got new rust. The county finally fenced the place, then let the fence go. Kids kept cutting it. Men like me kept putting new sections up when the county didn't, because we had our names on small businesses and didn't want to be the kind of men who left holes where kids could slip. Last June, my daughter's school bus started a different route for summer school, and it took them over the creek road. She came home with the window-squashed face you get at 14 when you've spent a ride pretending you weren't looking at something. After dinner, she set her plate in the sink and said, too casual, "Why does it sound like a playground by the creek?" Her mother looked at me and I thought of a heat I hadn't felt in decades. I told my girl, "It's frogs," because that's what my father told me when I brought him the same question. My father said it with the weight of a man who'd carried windows out of a gym after a storm and didn't have hands left for legends. It wasn't frogs then either. Later that night, the 3 of us sat on the sofa with the TV on low while the weather droned about a ridge of high pressure sitting ugly over the whole coastal plain. The house smelled like soap and lemon floor cleaner. We all pretended it was a normal night. I agreed to fix the drawer that sticks and to call the guy about the hot water heater. My wife said she'd bring sweet tea to the next booster meeting. In a town like ours, it's the binder rings of small promises that keep you from unraveling when a big one goes missing. Around 11, we heard laughter outside. People who don't live here think laughter sounds the same everywhere. It doesn't. This laughter was light and clipped, perfectly spaced, as if a metronome was keeping the time. My wife muted the TV. You could hear shoes on gravel, not the shuffle of teens trying to be quiet. Fast, purposeful steps. We waited for a knock. There was none. After a minute, the footsteps went away down the block. The laughter did not. It drifted, it pooled, and then it was gone, and the cicadas came back with their blunt, saw-toothed insistence. I told myself what every adult tells themselves. A neighbor had friends over. A recording was playing. The heat was doing tricks. But the heat doesn't make shapes in your hallway. The next morning before work, I was in the bathroom shaving and saw 4 narrow scuffs in the dust on the threshold, as if the toes of 4 small shoes had lined up there and turned, waiting on each other. It was probably my girl's shoes, I told myself, or some pattern in the broom. Then I remembered we don't use a broom. There's a way fear enters your schedule that feels like finding someone else's handwriting in your planner. It shows up between your oil change and the meeting with the concrete guy. It's penciled in, faint and certain, and there's no one to call about it. That week, I ordered a new lock for the fence around the bus barn and told myself it was only because the last one had rusted through. The package arrived in a plastic envelope with a thank you card from a man in Ohio who said he too had children. I took the lock to the barn after closing up my shop, the way some men take flowers to graves. The gate chain had been cut again with something clean. I threaded the new lock anyway and pocketed the cut-off link the way you might pocket a stone from a river. Nothing much changes in the barn. The smell is the thing. Tin and mouse urine and the long outgassing of tires that have melted into the concrete like coins pressed flat on a track. You can still see the yellow arcs on the walls where buses used to pull in and rub their bellies against baked tin. There are faded chalk marks on the cinder blocks for height checks. Evan, 1977. A calendar from a fertilizer company with a woman in a hat and a 5-digit phone number. I was looking at all that and talking to myself about powders for rats when I noticed the floor in the second bay felt cooler through my boots. I went looking for rats. I found under the second bay the shadow of a bus. Not the bus. I mean the absence of light cast by something that wasn't there, the way a photograph of a removed picture leaves a cleaner rectangle on the wall. The concrete under that bay was lighter by the outline of a bus. The outline was crisp along the front and along the sides, and it missed its back end by a foot, as if the thing that used to rest there had been parked a little crooked. I stood in the outline and the air pressed at my shins. It felt like when you're in a doorway, and someone on the other side is about to come through and both of you try not to move at once. When I got home, my wife said, "You look like you've been somewhere you shouldn't," which is one of those lines that has no jealousy in it after a certain age. I told her I'd gone to the barn and she closed her eyes the way you do when you slam a cabinet with your mind. We didn't fight. We didn't need to. She went to bed. I stayed up and clicked around the internet for records that don't exist because the sheriff lost so many boxes in a flood in '99. I looked at old newspaper scans that promised more on page 4, and then measured the gap where page 4 ought to be. I listened to the refrigerator make a sound like a slow exhale. I slept on the couch like a man who doesn't want to surrender to the idea of a hallway. Sleep didn't land. Sometime before dawn, I heard laughter again, this time close to the window over my head. It was a child's laugh that didn't follow the rules of breathing. It came in a cluster of 5, then nothing, then 9, then a single giggle that hung there like a bead on a string and never dropped. I lay still and felt the couch fabric sticking to my skin. There were steps on the porch, then the soft scrape of something on the glass. Not fingernails, shoes. The toe of a small shoe testing the pain, the way kids do when their hands are full of a backpack and the door is heavier than they expected. Then a pause. Then 4 light steps away. Then the click of nothing. You can't live with that. You can't go to the counter and do invoices with your shoulders sitting around your ears. So I did what the men before me have done, which is make an excuse to be busy. I called Rafe, who is now an assistant principal, and whose voice still carries the same little dare as when he cut the lock first. I told him I was putting a new lock on the fence and wanted to see if the county would reimburse. He laughed and said, "Hell no," then got quiet and added, "I heard them too last week after the softball game. Sounded like a field trip cutting across the outfield." We got there with one lantern between us, the kind you plug in that smells like melted plastic when it's hot. The sky was orange cut with purple. I could taste dust at the back of my throat. We wasted time on the practical. Checked the fence, wiggled the chain link where kids had pried it up, kicked at the boards stacked inside like tumbled dominoes. We told ourselves we were looking for nests for reasons, for evidence that didn't have a voice attached to it. When the light got the kind of flat that erases edges, we went into the barn. The laughing began behind us. It rolled in low, then rose as if the creek bank had tilted toward us and spilled. I took one step out of the outline and felt that small resistance again. A pressure like your kid trying not to let you leave the room without a hug. Rafe said, "Alma?" In the voice you use when you know the person you're calling has been dead longer than you've been paying your mortgage. The answer came from the creek, from the vines and the old fence posts in the one tire that's been half a yard into the mud for as long as I've known how to count. Not words. A change in temperature that made the hair on our forearms lift in unison. You can walk towards something like that if you're a certain kind of fool. I am not. I did what my father did. I started talking to whatever I couldn't see like it was a neighbor I had to work with. I said, "You're scaring people." I said everything that could be done got done. The laughing didn't stop. It just thinned, the way rain does when the storm decides to spend its water somewhere else. Rafe stepped out of the outline and nothing stopped him. Nothing visible. But when he reached the door of the barn, he flinched like he'd gotten off a bus too quick and his knees were not ready for the ground. We went home before dark, because that's the lie you tell the night, that you left because you weren't scared. Later I learned Rafe slept with his lights on. I did too. The next morning my wife said without preface, "You won't take her on that road." She meant our daughter. I told her I'd already called the school to request a route change. I hadn't, I called then. The secretary said there were no changes available. I tried bribes, then politeness, then patience, then finally that clipped tone that gets you nowhere in a small office. She told me there wasn't a bus to spare. I told her there was one, and felt ashamed of myself for the meanness of it after I hung up. I drove behind the bus that afternoon just to see. The sky had that bleached look that means it's hot even under trees. When the bus crossed the creek, I rolled down my window and listened. The cicadas were loud enough to sound like tearing paper. Over them, just barely, was the laughter, not out of the bus but around it as if it had drawn a weather system. My fingers made the steering wheel sticky. I looked at the bus's windows and saw, reflected there, exactly what you'd expect. Summer, leaves, the bleached undersides of oak branches. For a second I saw something else, a darker band cutting across the seats like a shadow where there was no roofline to make one. I pulled over on the far side of the bridge and sat with the hazard lights clicking like a polite metronome, as if anyone needed help and I could offer any. My girl got off at her stop and jogged to the truck with that "don't make me look like a kid" pace. She climbed in and buckled and said, looking at her lap, "Dad, we were full." I said, "It's summer school because you say the obvious to avoid the other thing." She shook her head and said, "We were full, but when the sun hit the windows, I saw we were more than full." I didn't ask her to explain. We drove home with the AC on high and the radio up. Old tricks to drown new noise. That night I dreamed I was in the second bay. It was one of those dreams with no trick to it. It was just a replay. The outline of the bus was cooler. The laughter came like water poured in another room. I turned my head and couldn't see past the first row of benches. The light in the barn stayed bright past them, but it wouldn't cross into the bus-shaped air. Something touched my sock, just the cotton of it, the smallest curl of pressure. I woke with my foot still curled like I'd tried to keep it from being touched. I didn't want my daughter within a mile of the creek. My wife agreed, and we made the kind of plan you can only make in a small place. I would drive her, even if it meant moving my morning jobs to the evening and losing the better light to work in. That morning, at the first turn, the truck's battery light blinked and the engine coughed like a smoker. I pulled over, shut it off, tried again. Dead. I called Rafe, who hates engines and loves kids, and he came in his sedan and we moved fast enough to make it before first bell. He said, "It's not just me, right?" And I said, "What's not just you?" And he said, "All week I've had the feeling I'm early to something." That afternoon, my truck started first turn. I drove to the barn. The lock I'd brought was still on the dash, unopened. I parked in the shade of the live oak and sat there a minute longer than necessary, then went in. The air was glue thick. I stood in the outline. It felt for the first time like standing in line, like the front of you was waiting for a turn and the back of you had already gone. In the chalk on the cinder block under Evan 1977, someone had added, "Long ago, bus 7," and under it a row of short marks, like a kid keeping score in a game no one else knew was being played. It's a hard thing to describe without sounding like you want to be believed. I don't care if I'm believed. I care that the laughter has a place to go. So I'll say it plain. I think the bus kept its route. I think whatever took it didn't stop it. I think in some thin seam of the day, when the light is too even and the heat sits square on the roof of your mouth, Bus 7 still pulls into that bay and waits, and little hands are still carrying little bags. And a driver who uses both mirrors taps the wheel and says a name in a kind of roll call that didn't make it into the sheriff's notes. I think the barn remembers what doors feel like when they open. That night, the laughter returned and stayed. It didn't care about our porch light or our prayers. It filled the hall, it filled the shape under the dining room table. It filled the space in front of the refrigerator where you stand to decide if you're hungry past 9. I took the lantern and drove to the barn. I didn't call Rafe. The air at the creek was syrup. On the bridge, I stopped and looked down. The water shone like polished leather. Something white the size of a dinner plate turned over once at the slow bend. The door of the barn had swollen in the heat. I had to put my shoulder to it. Inside, my light made a puddle that seemed to tilt away from the second bay. I walked into the outline. The laughter hushed, not like they were scared, but like we were all in the same room now and didn't need to call to each other. My feet made no sound on the concrete. The smell changed, or maybe my breath did. I could hear a turn signal, not mine. Slow, dutiful clicking. A bus waiting to make a left into someone's long driveway where a dog is always tied too short. "Let's go," I said. I don't know who to. I think to Alma. I think to the version of her that keeps her hands at 10 and 2. I think to the space where her face ought to be, because when the seam is open like that, you don't get faces. You get positions, you get jobs being done, you get heat and breath, and a line waiting to be seen. The turn signal stopped. There was that intake again, that pre-hiss. Every muscle in my lower legs drew together. The barn for a second smelled like chalk and whiteout, and the sweet dust you get from cardboard pencil boxes. The door somewhere else got ready to open. I don't know how long I stood like that. The lantern burned itself into a smell. Outside, a night bird made a notch in the air with each call. When the first pail slid under the door, the laughter thinned. Not gone, it never goes. It learned manners again and moved back toward the creek, as if too much attention would get the whole thing in trouble. I stepped out of the outline and my legs went watery, the way they do when you've been kneeling too long. I locked the door on my way out of habit or spite or both. In the days since, nothing changed and everything did. My daughter rides a different road now, because the principal is a man who grew up on the same laughter I did and understands that policy has the shape of a fence, not a wall. My wife leaves water on the counter at night for no reason she'll admit. I go to work and measure twice and cut once and tell people their decks will hold, and then I drive to the barn, not every day, not on purpose. Sometimes I only pass the road and the wind throws the yellow of ragweed into a shape that looks like a bus if you don't stare too long. There's a hiss I have learned to bear. Not the bus, but the hatch of the refrigerator. The breath of the AC, the way the house releases heat close to midnight. Every hiss is a door. Most of them are nothing. One of them isn't. One of them is that intake before the bus door comes open. It happens at different hours, never when I'm waiting. Always when I've turned my back on whatever cannot be fixed. When I hear it, I look out into the hall and see the scuffs where shoes have aligned. 4 and 4 not trying to be quiet or loud, just together. I opened the door to the night and the heat walked in as if invited. The street was empty. Our mailbox leaned a little, a habit it gets when the postal carrier is training someone new. The live oak at the corner was full of dry talk from insects. I stood on the porch and waited for the thing I couldn't see to decide if I was allowed to hear it. The turn signal stopped. A shape like a bus's shadow passed over the grass, then was gone. Behind me in the hall, the soft scrape of shoes took their places. I didn't turn around. I spoke like a driver when the bus is too full and everyone watches the same patch of road. "You made the turn," I said. "You're almost home." The air changed, hot vinyl, crayon, old peanut butter. Something brushed my pant leg where a child might steady themselves. A voice said, cheerful and work-like, "Watch your hands." And I knew I was standing in the aisle I'd brought home. The hiss came, the real one, and a space opened with fixed dimensions and a purpose no one could rewrite. I stepped into the rectangle of dark on my floor where an aisle would be. The porch light hummed. I heard rubber soles turn sideways to pass, a bag bump, a throat clear that didn't need air. "I'll walk with you," I said, and felt a nod beside my shoulder. We moved together like that. A man and the outline of children whose names aren't on paper, passing from heat into hallway, into that seam when the world overlaps itself and makes room for what it lost. The laughter kept to the edges like kids who remember library rules. The outline of a bus doesn't end at a barn. It runs through a county like a date no one will write again. In our house, the line stops just short of the door the way a route pauses before a mailbox. It paused there now. I heard the folding step and a low, kind, "Easy now." I didn't look for faces. I watched the scuffed threshold where 4 and 4 shoes align. When the air let go, the laughter thinned and drifted toward the creek in the barn. I counted the beats of a turn signal only I could hear until they matched my pulse and then missed it. I closed the door. The heat stayed a moment like an animal deciding if it belonged. It left. The house offered back its ordinary noises. At noon, I went to the barn without a light. The fence dipped where too many hands have pushed it. I stood at the bay and looked at the pale shape on the floor where a bus had never left, and said the one true thing I had. If you need, you can stop here. The word stop fell into the outline and loosened something in the heat. For a breath, the creek forgot its insects. Then soft as lint, laughter threaded the barn. Behind me, a turn signal clicked, cheerful, patient, the sound of a driver who knows you see her. I'm writing this on a Tuesday. It's late. My girl sleeps with one arm over her head. My wife left water on the counter and the stove light. The hallway is a lane if you look at it right. There are 8 scuffs, from outside cicadas, from far the creek. Then regular as a clock, the turn signal, 1. Then again, as if the house itself has pulled over. As if somewhere beyond the door a bus I cannot see has put on its blinker and is asking, polite as ever, to finish the route. I only knew the house on Belmer Court the way you know places you pass 1,000 times without ever really looking. Beige siding, a maple that leaned like a tired person, a chain-link gate that never seemed to close all the way. It was 2 blocks over from where we lived, and if you cut through the church lot and past the dumpsters behind the pharmacy, you came out almost eye level with its kitchen window. On early mornings, I walked my daughter to the bus stop at the corner. We'd wait where the street lamp ticked in that tired rhythm and made the pavement look like a breathing animal. The house wasn't where the bus stopped, but it was where the smell came from. On certain days, if the wind moved right, there was a cleanness in the air sharp enough to sting. Bleach, my mother-in-law would say when she visited, not the faint slice of a wiped counter, but the throat-burning kind you smell in public bathrooms when the mop water is fresh, and the sign says, "Hushin'." Wet floor and there's nowhere to step but through it. The day the boy bolted out of the front door, barefoot, hair matted, shirt twisted so badly the neck hole sliced across his shoulder, was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday is when the grocery store near the highway puts the dented cans on a rack for 2 for $1, and I always went after work. I was on my porch tying the trash bag, the kind that never stretches enough, when I heard the pop of the chain-link gate. The boy was fast and wrong in how he moved, like he'd been told to run in a dream and the dream kept yanking his legs at the wrong time. He crossed the street without looking. A white SUV braked and the guy inside leaned on the horn instead of the pedal, then threw both hands in the air like the boy had done something to him. He cut into the church lot and disappeared behind the squat hedges that hid the basement windows. For a second, I thought he might be one of the teenagers who lurked around the batting cages after dark, drunk and crouched in the pit behind the snack bar. But teenagers don't run like that, and they don't cry with their whole face. I didn't go after him. This isn't a hero story. I know how people work on our street. You mind your business until someone else minds it first. The woman across from us, the one with a porch couch wrapped in plastic, let out a low whistle like she was calling a dog. 2 houses down, Mr. Larkin peered around his blinds and then snapped them shut, the slats clacking like teeth. The bus turned the corner and my daughter tugged my sleeve the way she does when the crossing guard she likes is on duty. I bent to hug her, breathed into her hair, and thought of what I would make for dinner with those dented cans. By the time I came back from the store, the street had a noise to it I'd never heard before. Engines that didn't belong to our block gently idled, and somewhere a radio barked into the air and was then squashed low. If you've ever been near a house when it burns down, you know that strange quiet made by people not knowing where to put their voices. The boy had found a cop. People said he flagged one near the community center. Others said he screamed at a city truck until the driver called it in. However it happened, by 4 o'clock there were cruisers easing their tires onto the curb, a van with flashing bars that went round and round but didn't actually throw light, and 2 men in dark jackets who kept their hands in their pockets as if the air might sting more if they pulled them out. The house had always belonged to someone. Obviously, but I couldn't have told you a name. A man lived there, sometimes a woman, depending on who you asked, depending on what time. The yard was mowed, but only just before someone would complain. The mailbox hung crooked and the little red flag was bent in the middle. Once a package sat on the stoop for 3 days before it vanished, and on the 4th day I saw the box folded flat and shoved between the steps and the bushes like it had grown there. They went in through the front door and came out without looking at anyone. Then more of them went in, carrying those hard black cases with foam inside that make every tool look like a weapon. A woman with a clipboard set up at the edge of the driveway and everyone funneled through. Her. Lights, camera. A boy on a tricycle. Tried to ride up the driveway, but his mother caught him by the back of his shirt and hauled him into her side without a word. On the lawn, I saw a colored circle of something that looked like spray paint. Could have been from months before. Could have been nothing. I caught sight of the boy again at dusk, wrapped in a blanket that made him look like a moving scratch on the air. He sat on a low curb and stared at the hedge next to him, while the police did their low talking. His mouth opened now and then, and his tongue moved as if he were telling whoever lived in that hedge something important. A woman kneeled in front of him and spoke, and when he didn't answer, she kept her hands together and let him see her do the seeing of him. I stood there too long, so long that when my daughter came out to ask for a snack, I jumped like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. That's me laying out the scene. I could tell you that the smell got worse as night came, not better. That the bleach didn't cover the other smell so much as settle on top of it like a sheet hastily pulled over a shape you don't want to name. I could tell you that the maple by the driveway reached its summer leaf across the upper window, so that anyone inside might have watched all day through a gridded green. None of that matters unless I tell you the truth. And the truth is simple and heavy. A boy escaped from that house and said there were others still inside. He said it like it was a prayer. He said it like there was a clock he could hear that we couldn't. They took the boards off the basement windows the same way you peel back a scab. You tell yourself you'll do it clean in a smooth motion, but your fingers stick. It was past 9 and the streetlights had come on in that humming way that always makes me think of flies. The men with their hands in their pockets had put on thin masks by then, the blue paper kind that make ears stick out, and they lowered themselves into the rectangle of dark like divers. Someone ran an extension cord from the van to the basement and plugged in a light, and for a second the window glowed like a cut fruit. The flash of it made something inside my throat close. You don't need me to slow down here. You can feel it. None of us went to our porches for entertainment like people do in storms. We stood behind our hedges and we looked through gaps and we let the sound come to us in pieces. I wish I could tell you that the first thing out of the basement was a person. It wasn't. It was a bucket, blue with a cracked handle. Then it was another bucket. And then a roll of plastic that seemed to keep unrolling as they lifted it like it might never actually end. Then it was a board wrapped in plastic, slick as a fish. After that I looked away. There's only so much someone can decide to witness and live with in the same skin. I went inside and made my daughter toast with cinnamon because that's the only sweet we had left in the house. When I carried it to where she lay on the rug watching a show with a talking dog, she asked, "Did they find the people?" In that way kids have of asking questions like, they're pushing a door very gently to see if it's locked. I told her they were looking. She nodded in earnest like my words were a windshield wiper clearing away what she didn't need to worry about. She fell asleep on the rug just like that, the TV light blinking over her socks. The news never said the words we said to each other. They used investigation and ongoing and no threat to the public, which is the sentence they spray on situations like foam you can shape and then leave. The next day the trucks were gone, but the house stayed taped. Someone stapled a paper to the door that flapped whenever the wind changed. People came to look at it and took pictures with their phones like tourists in a city they would never admit they lived in. By afternoon, the porch couch lady had a lawn chair set up and a cooler at her feet, and she didn't bother pretending she was out for air. I brought my trash can back from the curb and kept my eyes on the silver lid like maybe there would be a message there if I stared hard enough. The boy wasn't on our street after that. Rumor sent him a few places. The hospital with the big fish tank, the office with the soft chairs where people practice using feelings like tools. A woman from the church said he knew the names of the kids who hadn't been able to run, and that he said them in order, clearing his throat between each one as if even the act of speaking had to be clean. Another person said he didn't speak at all and moved his fingers like counting. Everyone was certain of the small piece of the story they'd touched. It made everyone feel the size of their lives. That would have been the end of it for me, except the landlord called. That's another part you should know. We rent. The house is fine. It has a chimney that doesn't draw right and a back door that swells in summer. And it sits on the kind of small wedge of land that makes you mow at weird angles. The landlord lives 2 towns over, and whenever he calls, he starts with a compliment like, "You two really know how to keep the place together." When I answered, he did that again, then talked about his cousin in code. "She's in a jam," he said, "and I'm wondering if you've got it in your hearts to help me for a week or 2. That's landlord speak for. There's a person who needs a bed, and they will be your problem as soon as I hang up. I told him we didn't have a spare room. He said she doesn't take up much space, and that was that. Her name was Dee. She arrived with a grocery bag of clothes and a spiral notebook. 30? Give or take the kind of years that etch a face into something harder than 30 should have. She looked at my daughter the way someone looks at a bench before sitting, careful not to presume. That first night I made spaghetti with jar sauce and we ate at the little table with the burn mark shaped like Florida. Dee kept her notebook under her thigh like it might slide away if she didn't keep pressure on it. She thanked me in a voice that sounded like it had recently been used to scream. I didn't ask what her jam was. People think they want the spilling of the story, but there's a price on listening and I hadn't counted my money. We made a bed for her on the couch with the soft blanket that follows us from rental to rental. She turned the notebook sideways and drew lines like little fences. At some point after midnight, she went out to the porch to smoke, and the smell threaded itself through the screens like rope that had been dragged through fire. It took her 3 days to tell me. Not all at once, not in a monologue. In pieces, as if she were walking around a pit and showing me where ground had given way. She worked for a cleaning service. Not a company with wrapped vans and polos, but a woman named Tally with a phone that never stopped vibrating on the table. Tally had a stable of regulars, elderly widows who left too many teacups in the sink, men who lived alone and didn't try to make a house out of it. The house on Belmer Court had been one of those. Dee called it the quiet house, like it had a personality. The man who paid cash wore gray socks no matter the season. He never left the house when they were there, but he wasn't exactly in it either. He stayed behind the air, she said. It took me a second before I understood that she meant doors and hallways, and the thin space around someone who doesn't want to be touched by your looking. Tally told them never to go down to the basement. No code for the lock, she'd say, and then they'd act like that was enough of a reason. Dee, though, she knew the smell of bleach when it's trying too hard. Every Friday, the empty bottles went out with the recycling lined up like exhausted soldiers. The mop head was always wet. The drains ran fast. Sometimes they'd hear a thump and tell themselves it was the dryer. Once Dee saw a crosshatch of scrape marks near the basement door, narrow and shiny as paper cuts. It's a house, she told me, holding her coffee with both hands like it was talking to her. Houses make noises. Houses have their own minds. The point isn't to figure it out. The point is to keep moving. She said it like a vow she had broken. The last Friday she worked there, she went alone. Tally had another job across town and promised she'd swing by when she was done to check the final. Spray and bless, Tally always said. She meant the sweet stuff with fake lemon that tells noses a lie. Dee did the bathrooms, the kitchen, the stairs. She emptied the little blue bins into the big black one, saving the basement door for last. The lock had a number pad that blinked red whenever it was touched. Someone had wiped a thumb across the numbers so often the plastic had gone opaque. As Dee moved to pass it, a phone vibrated somewhere below. Not the house phone. A private pocket sound. It rattled a wooden surface, paused, rattled again. She stood perfectly still without telling her body to do that. The phone vibrated a third time and then, faint as the inside of a seashell, she heard a voice say hello. She didn't remember putting the wastebasket down. She remembered her hand hovering over the keypad, fingers smeared with invisible grease from the lemon polish. She remembered no code and then the door opening anyway. Like when your car doors don't all click and the one you need is already giving, she said. She went down the first 2 steps and smelled what the bleach had not reached. She went down 2 more and saw a shape on the floor that her mind tried very hard to make into a pile of blankets. The voice was still speaking into a phone. It said hello again in a way that did not believe in rescue but had to practice it. Because what else are you supposed to do? She went down the rest of the stairs because sometimes people move because their bodies are old machines and a button has been pressed. There were 2 rooms. One of them had a chained refrigerator and a hot plate and the kind of metal table you see in church basements, with dented edges where boys have banged quarters to make them flip. The other room had bunks. The phone lay on the floor under one, buzzing against cement. A boy's face looked back at her from the shadows like he had held his breath for so long he had turned into a still photo. I like to think I'm a good person, she said. Then I saw myself in that moment and I was someone who should have run. She stood there and turned into someone who knew the shape of a chain without touching it. She turned into someone who could see where the screws had been tightened and where they had slipped. She turned into someone who could hear the house breathing. The boy who ran wasn't the one speaking. The boy who ran was under the stairs, thin as a ladder. When his eyes rose to her, she felt a hand press down between her shoulder blades and shove. She told me she didn't know who did it, but her body landed on the floor with her palms out and her mouth open like she'd been the one calling. The boy ducked out and streaked toward the light without a sound. She sat there a second longer, like maybe she was supposed to be a decoy. Then she stood and the phone stopped vibrating and the voice inside it said, "Please." And this is the part where her voice fell so low I had to lean in. She said, "I'm so sorry," to a voice in a phone and went back up the stairs. She shut the basement door. She sprayed the lemon. She pulled the front door closed and it sucked in its breath with that soft kiss doors make when they seal. She put the key under a chipped frog statue in the garden the way Tally told her to. Then she walked to the corner and waited for the bus and stared at the dogwood across. From the stop until the flowers looked like 100 white faces pressed flat to the glass. I wanted to tell her she wasn't a monster. I wanted to tell her you don't know who you will be until something shows you the exact door that leads to what you can't do. The week we took her in, the landlord didn't check on us once. The police never came to our door. The house on Belmer Court sat with its windows shut like a person holding a breath to stop a cough. A crew came in paper suits and carried out bags that didn't bend. Someone from the city sprayed something on the sidewalk that left bright dots like confetti. People stopped bringing their dogs down our street because the dogs pulled away and shook themselves after, as if their coats had gotten wet. After my daughter fell asleep, Dee and I sat at the little table and watched the streetlight shudder. It did that thing. 3 ticks of brightness, then a hum, then 3 again, like a cheap miracle repeating itself. She held the notebook open but didn't write in it. I said, because I couldn't not, "What about the other voices?" and then wanted to take the words back again. She said, "They were not voices. They were boys," and let her hand press flat on the paper until it made a squeak. I didn't sleep. Every house noise felt like a foot on the steps. There is a way a floorboard remembers weight. When it pops at 1 in the morning, you can hear who it loved. I went to the kitchen and ran water for no reason. I watched the window reflect my face in the room behind me and waited for it to show me someone else. When I finally fell into a sleep, I dreamed I was walking the block and could smell bleach in places it had never been. Under my car seat, in my daughter's backpack, in the basket where we keep winter hats. I dreamed I scrubbed my own hands with a green sponge until the sponge went white. The next day, Dee left. No note. The blanket folded so precisely it felt like the opposite of sleep. The notebook gone. The landlord called that night to say, "You two really are saints," and then said his cousin had gotten a place with a friend on the south side. I said I hoped she was okay. He made a noise like an old radio losing a station and said, "People bounce back," which is a thing people say who haven't bounced anywhere that costs them their knees. Weeks went by. There are only so many tricks a summer can play before it turns into fall and starts repeating itself. The maple got tired and began to let go. The bus route changed and the crossing guard my daughter liked moved 2 blocks up. I went to work and came home and cooked meat too long in a pan. I thought of the boys in the basement every time I tied a trash bag. The knot like a locking device in miniature. At church, people asked for thoughts in a careful way, and then we sang about mercy like we knew the words first, the music second. Here is where I tell you about the sound. It was not a sound at first. It was a feeling like a sound breaking in half and each half choosing a different door. Late one night, with the TV's blue light washing the room into a drowned place, something tapped the bottom step to our basement. We do not have a finished basement. It is damp storage where we keep holiday bins and the vacuum that lost its hose and the paint. The landlord swore matched the wall, but never does. Our basement door has no lock. The tap came again. Then a third time, not louder, just more certain. I could say it was pipes or the house settling or a clock I had once owned ticking in a box I'd forgotten. I could say it was a rat. I will say it was a finger. I went to the door. My hand sat on the knob like a bird with its claws in wire. There is a moment before you do something where you feel who you will be if you don't. I twisted. The door swung and the smell came up, not bleach, never bleach, but the stale sweetness of air that has not touched sun. The single bulb swayed, moving light along the cement in a slow oval like a watch run underwater. At the bottom of the stairs there were no shadows that looked like boys. There were bins. There was the vacuum. There was the jar where we keep screws and washers that came with furniture and will never fit anything again. There was a shape that might have been a pile of old pillows. It wasn't. Of course it wasn't. It was the blanket we had given Dee, folded the way she had left it, sitting on the floor as if it had grown out of the cement. I carried the blanket up like it was sleeping. My daughter was asleep. The TV was still talking. The streetlight outside did its soft, relentless flash. I set the blanket down and it slid spread open exactly to the size of the space where a person would lie. On one corner, barely there, was the print of a hand. Not dirty, not bloody, not even wet. Just the memory of fingers pressed with such constant, patient pressure that the nap changed. In the morning, I called the landlord and asked for the code to the locks he used at the last place he had us. He laughed and said there'd be no need for that here, then laughed again when I didn't. I told him our basement door didn't feel safe. He told me doors were never the issue. It was what people decided to bring through them. I hung up and stood with the phone in my hand, feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. That night, I moved the dresser in front of the basement door, and when it scraped the floor, the sound was like someone dragging a heavy plastic-wrapped thing and pretending the noise was normal. Since then, I smell bleach when it rains. I smell bleach when it doesn't. I smell bleach in the school hallway when I go to pick up my daughter early for the dentist, and the janitor frowns at the scuffs near the art wall. I smell bleach in the milk aisle when I bend to grab the store brand, a sour edge that doesn't belong. On Belmer Court, the house sits with a sign in the front window that says property of city, and something else in Sharpie about prosecution. The maple keeps being a tree because that is what it knows how to do. Deserted places never look deserted enough. They always ask your eyes to fill in. Last week at the bus stop, my daughter pressed her ear to my stomach the way she did when she was small and pretended she could hear the ocean in there. "What do you hear?" I asked to play along. She said, "A beep." And then, like numbers. I could end this with a thought about how everything terrible gets cleaned until it shines enough for the papers to stop using verbs. I could end this the night I walked our block at 3 a.m. and watched the streetlight tremble and counted my steps and told myself that hearing is only hearing when it belongs to you. But that isn't the final thing. The final thing is easy. On quiet afternoons, when the sun through the kitchen stutters behind the fan blades and the house feels like a held breath, a phone vibrates somewhere under the floor. It is faint. It rattles a wooden surface and then stops and then rattles again. Sometimes it is followed by that tiniest voice, practicing hello the way a person practices forgiveness, not because they believe it will happen, but because their mouth wants to know the shape of it. I have lain on the kitchen tiles with my ear pressed to the cool and tried to locate it. I have told myself it's one of our old phones. It slipped between floorboards, a simple story. Then rhythmically, there it is. A hum like a heartbeat too far away to save. I put my hand to the tile. The line between my house and that house feels soft. The call keeps coming, and the bleach, even now, rises through the seams of the quiet as if someone somewhere is still trying to make everything clean. I didn't go to the fair the night the Ferris wheel stopped. I was at the late shift at the diesel shop off East Line, catching bolts in my palm and listening to a compressor rattle like an old Weezer. I smelled like solvent and hot rubber when the news reached me by way of a customer who couldn't get his ignition to turn. "Lights went out on the whole wheel," he said, pointing up as if the thing were sitting over my bay. 3 kids gone. Folks are screaming themselves hoarse. I thought he was trying to save a discount with drama until he turned off his own voice and stared through me like he'd found a window there and didn't like the view. I wiped my hands and told him the switch he needed, and then I stood in the doorway of the bay and took a breath that didn't go anywhere it was supposed to. I didn't go to the fair that night. I told myself it wasn't my business. The truth was, I was afraid I would recognize the sound a parent makes when a name falls out of their mouth and won't land. By the time I clocked out, the fairground was a black smear beyond town, out past the half-vacant storage units and the pine lots where people dump mattresses. Nacadel is a place where everyone knows who bought the wrong bread and who claims to see lights in the woods, and yet nothing ever happens if you tell it right. The night the wheel stopped, everybody told it wrong. They said the cabin swung in the wind with nobody inside. They said the operator kept his finger on a dead red button and never looked down. They said 3 mothers stood with hands on the same piece of fence and never spoke to one another, like the fence could only hear one of them at a time. I drove out there at dawn when the light is a color you don't have a word for until it's over. You could still smell the oil that rides keep in their joints. A metal closeness like a coin sucked and spat into a child's palm. Earth looked more pressed than trampled, as if the place had been folded and flattened and put back. The fair had blown in on long trucks with tarp sides 2 days before, printing the roads with leaf-shaped mud. They were gone by morning. No tire tracks, no trash. Even the flyers seemed to pull themselves from tape and drift away. The only things left were torn tent hems snagged on rebar, scuffed circles where the teacups had spun, and an indented ring in the grass like a shallow crown. Sheriff Hardin's cruiser idled until his battery lost its patience. He kept folding and unfolding his hat brim like a man trying to iron with his hands. Folks went quiet when he got near and spoke louder as soon as he passed, like waves closing after a boat. He had that look of a person trying to recall a measurement they knew in high school and never thought they'd need again. When he walked the grounds, he stepped carefully, not to preserve prints, but like he didn't want to offend the dirt. I took a slow lap by myself, and it felt like being late to your own bad news. I had known the Greers all my life. Their front step sat on the same cinder blocks it always did, with 1 block short so the porch listed as if listening. Their mother, Missy, had a grocery list taped inside the cabinet and a line of bargain brand cereals on top of the fridge. She always bought the kind in bags. Sammy played with my nephew in the drainage ditch after storms, making boat races out of cut soda bottles. June never sat still. She buzzed like a fly and then slept like a stone, a switch I envied. The third kid wasn't family to them, Ely, but you'd never know it by the way he called Missy ma'am, like she kept weather in the pantry and could loan him some if he asked nice. They had gone to the fair to see the animals and chew on blue ice and argue about whether the wheel or the zipper was braver. People told it like this. The wheel stopped and the lights went hard dark and the cabins swung. And when the lights returned, there were empty cabins that wore the idea of kids the way a seat wears a coat's warmth after it's been stood from. They said the operator shook his head once like a man trying to clear his ears and then stared at his hands to make sure they were his. People set up folding tables at the fairground with coolers and paper cups, and they brought lawn chairs like they were camping a waiting room. A man from the church on Willow led prayers until his voice was a filament in a bulb that should have been replaced. Deputies walked the perimeter and squatted to prod the dirt like they were trying to understand footprints that had second thoughts. The county pitched floodlights that spat moths and made a stage out of nothing. Kids whispered to each other and dared each other to touch the places where the rides had sat, the way people dare each other to touch a hot stove after someone else has already done it. By noon, the town had made a routine of not finding what they were looking for. People love routine. They prefer it to answers because you can argue with answers, but routine is a habit, and habits don't care what you say to them. I work with my hands. I do better when there's a bolt to loosen or a filter to swap. So I looked for the operator, the man with the finger on the dead red button. I'd seen him once when I drove past on my way home the day before. A thin guy with a ponytail and a sweatshirt, even though it was early June, and the heat had glassed the pavement. He had a tattoo that looked like an old map with varnish peeling. People said he smoked the whole time he ran the ride and flicked butts into a coffee can. People said his eyes were silver like the underside of a carpenter bee. People say things. They say them so they don't have to count how many times they're repeating themselves. I asked around and all I got was soft starts. He seemed, you know how... That trailing off people do when the rest of the sentence would force a part of them to stand up and be counted. It made me angry at the vague and the way it holds hands with fear and pretends to be helpful. 2 nights later, after the volunteers thinned and the Carter family packed up their grill, I cut through the fairground in the wet warmth that comes before a storm. My boots sank in the soft places where generators had once chattered. The Ferris wheel base sat like a clean circle where a dish had been lifted, a white ghost on grass. I crouched and touched the dirt. It was hard as a table. Then I heard it, laughter. It wasn't children and it wasn't adults. It was that in-between pitch kids hit when they're doing a joke they don't understand yet, but they like the shape of it. The field has a voice at night, a cheap hush, but this sound had a location the way you can point at a smell and be right. It came from somewhere lower than my feet. I thought of drains and old wells and the way the town maps put circles in wrong places and call them utilities. I moved my light over the grass and caught something metal winking at me like it had a private joke. I followed the sound to the midway, or where the midway should have been, if the lights and whack-a-mole had not packed themselves and left. A length of rope hung from a metal eye in the ground, the frayed end wet and black as if it had dragged a creek for hours. The stake it tied to sat twisted like something had lifted and turned it, like the earth had watched then laughed and turned its eyes away. When the laughter came again, I noticed the way it echoed, not outward but down. I stamped once with my heel, and the sound came back like a soft knock from a neighbor in an apartment where you share a wall with your own head. The ground had a hollow. That's what I told myself. It had a hollow and the sound had found it. That's all. I found the outline of a square in the grass, like the hatch of a storm shelter in a movie where the tornado already made up its mind. Everyone in town knows someone with a van full of tools. Mine is a rusted green two-seater with a sliding door that sticks and a ratchet set under the passenger chair. I went home for the pry bar and a flashlight with a cone of light the color of tea. On the way, I passed Missy Greer sitting on her porch with a quilt over her knees in weather no one put quilts on for. Her mother sat next to her with a hand on her knuckles like it might keep them from spilling. They looked at the same cypress knot in the porch railing and didn't say a word. I didn't stop. I told myself the thing I was going to lift wasn't a door to her kids, only a door to a space that could be measured. If you can measure a thing, you can live next to it and not go crazy. If you can measure it, you can lie to yourself about endings and be believed for a while. The van door slammed with a sound that told the neighborhood it had happened 100 times before, and would happen 100 more. The hatch gave after the fourth lever up, as if the wood itself had to make up its mind and finally did. The space beneath breathed out a smell like pennies in dirt. I shined my light and saw stairs cut from concrete that had been poured in boards. The wood grain was fossilized in it like pressed ferns. The laughter came again, but far away now. Like a radio left in another room, and then the sound of something rolling. Not a ball, more like a rope coil settling or a snake of chain. This was the point where a person with sense would call someone. I am not a person with sense when I have my hand on a solved problem. I went down. The door shut itself with a slow clap, not a bang. A bit of grass fell with it and made a crosshatch of shadow on the step that I had to step over like a superstition. The basement, if that's what you call a space that doesn't belong to any building, widened under the fairground. My light showed pillars made from stacked tires encased in cement, a cheap trick that holds weight in a way you don't want to think about. The walls were close at first, and then they were not. There were tunnels off tunnels, some tall enough to walk, others low enough that you'd have to go crabwise. I saw chalk lines on the floor, hopscotch squares with numbers missing and arrows that suggested a direction a kid would like. I saw a nail pounded into a wall with a loop of ribbon hanging. The ribbon dirty, in a way cloth gets dirty when it's been touched 100 times by hands that don't care. In one corner, bottle caps sat in a circle like coins around a wishing well too shallow to drown in. My light showed a mural someone had wiped with a wet sleeve. Animals with blocky heads and grins, the kind you win when you pop the right balloons. I called out once, soft. Nobody wants their voice to carry far underground. "Sammy?" I said, and then, "Ely, June." Saying their names made me feel foolish and old, so I coughed and called, "Hello?" The echo wrote the word down in a ledger and filed it. Something scuffed behind me. A slow, deliberate drag that could have been my imagination if I hadn't felt it in my ankle bones. I swung the light. The beam picked up a gold wrapper, the kind that comes on cheap candy that promises more than it delivers. It was folded to a point and tucked into a crack like a child hides a note. That's when I realized the chalk arrows had been brushed over and then redrawn, like a path that keeps being adjusted after a rehearsal. The laughter drifted again, thinner now, and I could tell it was not coming from a person so much as from a thing that remembered people. I kept moving because to stop would be to listen for the laugh again, and I had decided I would not listen for it, which is how you end up hearing something more. I found a red stripe painted waist-high along a corridor. It was too neat for spray paint. It had been brushed with care, then scraped with keys or a nail at hip height, the way metal makes loops when you walk in too tight spaces. The corridor opened into a room with a ceiling low enough to make me bow, hung with triangles cut from plastic tablecloths. The bunting carnival people love because it makes an event even when the event is just waiting. In the center stood a little wheel on a post like a raffle spinner made by someone who remembers plans better than wood. It had nails for pegs and it clicked when I turned it, soft the way a moth clicks when it forgets glass isn't sky. The wheel stopped pointing at a corner of the room where the bunting had collected twice as much dust. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, so much as the lack of a footstep that should have happened when I moved. I turned slow. A man stood in the corridor mouth, tall the way light makes people tall when you face it, not when you meet them in a store. He had the kind of face people can't remember because it folds things into itself, the lines of it already agreeing. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He pointed at the wheel and said, If it points to you when it stops, you get a wish. His voice was the ordinary voice you'd want a neighbor to have when you ask for your rake back. He wore a sweatshirt even though the air down there had the cool of a place that doesn't know summer. He nodded like we were both at work and we knew what work we were doing. "I'm looking for the kids," I said, which felt like the wrong line in the wrong scene, and the man nodded again like I'd confirmed an inventory. "We're always looking for the kids," he said. "You know how that is." He stepped closer and the light took his eyes and did something to them, hollowed them without taking color. He had a coffee can in his hand, the rim dented in one place, and inside it lay a drift of ashes with dark commas like curled beetles. He tapped the can with 2 fingers. A sound like a coin nudging a coin in a pocket. "I keep these," he said. And when I didn't ask what these were, he smiled like I had passed a test I didn't study for. "You should go," he added, and he said it in the tone of someone whose permission you didn't ask for and don't want. There was a square cloth pinned to his shirt with a safety pin, the kind a vendor might wear if you wanted to pretend your crew had names. Sharpie letters bled until they were only a shape. "You left fast," I said, my voice more steady than my hands. "Whole outfit gone by sunup." "Not even your flyers," he shook the can. "We don't leave," he said. "We arrive differently. Depart the same." He set the can on the table and the ash inside sloped as if remembering a wind and then settling for lack of it. You hear them?" I asked before I could ask something smarter. He tilted his head, like the sound had crept up behind him and he was considering whether to introduce it to me. "You are hearing what isn't sad yet," he said. "You want it to be the kids because then you have a direction to take, a door to bang. If I say it is the generator settling, you will feel better. If I say it is pipe, you will feel better. But if I say nothing, you will inventory yourself in the dark. People don't like their own I said the names again and he smiled the way people do when a prayer rolls over them that isn't for them. He lifted a palm. "We do not say names in the complex," he said. "It brings repetition. Repetition brings weight. You will find what you follow." He took a step and the coins on the raffle wheel flashed once as if lit from inside. "Sometimes folks think the fair builds itself," he said. "They see we raise the lights fast and they think we pull it from the air like ribbon. Truth is the place brings—" "Who are you?" I said, anger returning like a warm coat. He made a face like I had mispronounced a word I should already know. "I watch," he said. "I keep the red stripe from wandering." He tapped the line on the wall with his knuckle. "And when the wheel points your way, I remind you that wishes can't be spent like loose change." He turned. Then, and the row of triangles on the string turned with the breeze of him, nodding without enthusiasm. I put the pry bar down because a man with a bar is a man of... He led me deeper into the complex and I used his word for it, because there are times when yours don't fit. The rooms changed. One held nothing but folding chairs with a pen mark on each seat, as if names had been there and were rubbed away. Another held shelves made of milk crates zip-tied to rebar, stacked with glass jars of screws and buttons and the sort of odds people drop when they're getting out of a place quick. I saw a hair clip shaped like a heart with one prong gone. I saw a sneaker lace with a... We came to a crossroads of tunnels and he paused like he was letting a thought choose a path. The laughter had thinned. What I heard now was the sound of distance, the way empty buildings have a hum you don't hear until midnight. "We had a Ferris in Dunn's Meadow before we had one anywhere else," he said, like he was teaching local history to a class that didn't want it. "Before your father dragged a deer out of that ditch and before your mother discovered she prefers tea when she is angry. Before your..." He walked to it and looked at me like it was my idea in the first place. I put fingers to the seam and felt that it was not a seam but a crack around a door, the kind without a handle. I pushed and it gave like a shoulder. The room inside was smaller than any that came before. The ceiling closed the way ceilings do in old closets where coats used to sway. On a crate sat an old carnival prize, a plush snake with button eyes and a smile that knew more than it let on. The smile was stitched crooked as if to... "Why?" I said, and my mouth didn't like the shape of the word here. "Why do this? Why the wheel? Why the laugh? Why any of it?" He breathed in like he had to count to 5 before talking to a child. "Because you asked for it," he said. "Because the town wants to be a story so badly it makes the story happen. You want a night you can circle on a calendar. You want words to say when you are old and don't want to talk about your hands anymore. You say the fair brings predators. You hope it does because the..." I thought of Missy's bargain cereal and the quilt out of season and the look on her face like someone had put a weight on her tongue. I thought of Eli's dad. who sharpened mower blades behind the school and always smelled like belt leather. I thought of how the town built a circle of coolers and floodlights and turned worry into a picnic, because we are built to gather, to make a shape with our bodies when we can't make meaning. I thought of how the wheel had stopped and we had all leaned forward expecting a show, even though the show had already been ourselves. "And the kids?" I asked, "because you can't float too long without sinking onto the one question you brought." He nodded like he was pleased with the homework I'd chosen. "They are where they would be if the grown people were not looking so hard," he said. "They are in the place behind the game where the prizes stack up because they are lighter than air. They are in the space under the boards where the sawdust feels cooler, because the day was hot and the lights were bright and a man with a map tattoo You," I said, and my voice sounded like it had a corner in it. "You took them." He tilted his head. "I pointed," he said. I held out the can and pointed with 2 fingers. But I also kept the stripe. I marked the doors. I counted the turns. It is not always a kidnapping when a path leads downward. Sometimes a path is only the shape the ground prefers. I wanted to hit him then, to make the conversation simple the way a stopped fan can be made to move with a push. But his eyes, hollowed as they were by, "Come," he said. And when he turned, I saw the sweatshirt was not a sweatshirt at all, but a coat sewn from flags cut off their poles. There was a logo I didn't know in a corner, a circle with a line through it and patches where sun had murdered color. He took me through a passage where my shoulder brushed warm rock. We came to a room that sounded like an empty pool. My light found the source. A wall of lockers the same pale green they use in old schools, each with a number rubbed to a blur. On the floor. I stood a long time past when my knees began to complain and my light began to stutter the way cheap batteries do. He didn't move. He watched like watching had once been a job that paid, and now is just a habit. "You collected these," I said, and it came out with more admiration than I meant. "We forget everything else," he said. "We forget to buy new tape and the names of the men who welded the frames and whether the moon was new, the night the bearings burned. We forget the towns because they forget us." I walked him to the edge of the great circle where the Ferris had been, and looked for any sign of the 3. Footprints would have pleased me, or a hair caught on rebar, or a prize ticket with a number I could bring to a window and get something back. There was only dew. He looked at me the way a man looks at a slot machine after he's won, and knows the next pull will correct the luck. "You are going to tell them about the rooms," he said. "You will tell them about chairs without names and lockers with sigh. Days were a job I did." I went to the shop and changed filters and listened to customers talk about the fair as if it had been a weather event, as if you could measure it in inches of rain. The sheriff came by and asked me if I had seen anything, and I told him I had seen a man with a face you forget, and he nodded like he too had met that man 10 times and lost him 11. Missy folded laundry that did not get put away. Eli's dad cut the grass past the line where the neighbor's grass begins without being a... At night, the notebooks made the house sound different, as if pages could alter air. I would wake and the fan would be still, and yet there would be a turning on the wall, a pattern of spokes wobbling. At first I thought it was headlights slipping through blinds. Then I saw that the light was the color of the floodlights from the field, a pale insect-thick white that doesn't come from the street. It would glide across the ceiling and stop above the bed, and the pattern would point. And for a half second, on the 7th night, I carried one of the notebooks to the backyard and lit it in the grill. The paper caught and burned in a patient way, whole pages going at once like a crowd knows which way to stampede before anyone says. Ash rose light as moths and then fell all at once like a mood. I didn't feel better. The next night, the wheel turned again, and this time I heard the laughter not as a sound but as a choice waiting to be made that someone nearby already knew the answer to. I stood in the dark and I keep a length of red tape in a drawer, and some nights I touch it just to feel steadier. The fair will come again? Of course it will. If not here, then in a town with the same shape of streets and the same bargains and the same people who say a prayer out under moths when there is nothing else to do with their mouths. Trucks will arrive differently. They will depart the same. A circle will press into grass. A red stripe will keep to the wall. And someone will say names in the complex until repetition makes a weight and the ground decides what to hold and what to return. When I close my eyes. The first time I saw him, he was stirring sugar into a mug like he had all of midnight to waste. The hat made him taller. Not a fancy hat. Dust gray felt. brim pulled low enough to shade his eyes from the neon hum that shook in the window. He was half turned toward the door, so the coffee steam slid along his cheek and disappeared under the brim. I remember the screech of a reefer unit idling outside, the sound like ice grinding, and the way the waitress, Marta, set a slice of pecan pie on the counter without looking at him, like he'd ordered it weeks ago and she was just delivering on a debt. It was a Monday, late August, heat still clinging to the asphalt outside like something alive. My shift at the pumps had run long because some cattle hauler from upstate snapped his fuel card, and then the pump printer ate the receipt, and I was still getting used to being the night manager, which meant the one who couldn't leave. The place was called Mile Marker 621 because that's where it sat, a low rectangle of cinder block and fluorescence between Loma Paola and a stretch of mesquite that the highway forgot. If you were headed north, you saw our sign first, open 24 coffee, showers, home style. If you were headed south, you saw the back of the sign, where someone once spray-painted a broken halo and the words, "Hide your daughters." Nobody bothered to scrub that off. Maybe it helped business. Marta wiped the counter in slow stripes and told me her son had a fever, how she'd thought about calling out. But the landlord had taped a new note on the door and she didn't have it in her to choose. Her hands were dry and cracked from the sanitizer we kept at every station. She had a rosary tucked into the pocket of her apron, beads like little fish bones. She said, "You watch your girls tonight." And I told her I didn't have girls, and she said, "I meant the girls who come in." The pie clinked on the plate in front of his mug. He didn't look at it. If you worked nights at 621, the world sorted itself into types. There were the haulers who wanted a shower and a hot meal and would tip the change in their pocket with a kind of relief. There were the kids in lifted pickups who bought energy drinks and jerky and pretended to be dangerous. There were the locals who came to sit and talk about rain and fences and politics, who pretended they weren't lonely. And there were the women. Some were drivers, some hitchers, some just passing through on their way to some other life. And they wore the same tired look of someone who's been told too many times to smile. The rumor, one of them, was that we were not good for women. Not since back when the freeway was newer and the cafe was called Loma's, and the coffee was served in mugs that had the logo baked into the glaze. Just stories. I told Marta when she made the sign of the cross unconsciously, after a pair of girls came in with backpacks. People talk. But the way she pressed her lips together said yes, people talk, and sometimes they're trying to warn. The girls took a booth by the window where you could watch the fuel island. They were young enough to be loud without realizing it, the sound ricocheting off the tile and chrome. One had hair dyed the careful color of white wine. The other had a scar along her jaw that turned when she chewed. They ordered pancakes and asked if we had fresh strawberries and laughed when I said Fresh didn't make deliveries to 621. I didn't ask where they were headed. I learned that from Marta, who said if you asked, you took a little piece of the answer with you, and sometimes that piece was the last anyone got. The man in the hat didn't move except to stir. The spoon tapped the mug's rim at regular intervals like a distant signal. I thought he was waiting for someone. We all wait for someone out there. But the door opened and closed and every face in the glass came and went, and his spoon kept time. It was 3:27 when his phone vibrated against the formica. He didn't answer. The girls tried to split the check and their card wouldn't run. I comped the strawberries we didn't have and pointed at the ATM by the men's room, the one that left a thin ribbon of paper like a tail. The white-haired girl said, "We'll leave the bags." The night was busy in that quiet way that happens. Everything requiring a small motion. Wipe a spill, ring a pack of Camels, reset a pump, nod at a man's story, tell a kid the bathroom code, find the mop, unlock the cigs, fill the ketchup, a carousel that made your brain smooth. Somewhere between the mop and the cigs, the girls didn't come back. I didn't notice for a beat. Then I looked at the booth and saw their 2 backpacks slumped like bodies. The man in the hat sat exactly the same, the spoon stilled now, the pie untouched. "Bathroom?" Marta asked, and I nodded and went. The men's room was empty except for a smell like someone had tried to scrub away a red stain with lemon. The women's room door was wedged with a bucket. I eased it open. The stall doors were all shut, silver hasps straight as soldiers. I knocked knuckles on the middle one and said, "You good?" A voice whispered that sound of paper unrolling. No answer. I bent, felt the cold tile on my cheek, and looked for feet. Nothing. The stall doors were all empty, clean white. A spider behind the trash can bundled a fly. I came back out into the sign of neon and found the man's coffee steaming like nothing had changed. "You see those girls leave?" I asked him, casual. He turned his head enough that I glimpsed the non-color of his eyes, a blue washed to bone. He smiled with his mouth and not his cheeks. "Lots of traffic," he said. "Hard to keep track." Marta met my eyes with a kind of question that was already grief. She said, "You call?" and pointed her chin at the phone by the register. I did, out of practice more than hope. County picked up on the fourth ring, a deputy whose voice I recognized from high school algebra. I gave our mile marker and our problem. He said he'd swing through after finishing something out by the river. When I hung up, the man in the hat said, "You ever been east?" "Sure," I said. "San Alvaro once. There's a flea market that way." He put his spoon down with a tiny click. "I mean east," he said, and he tilted his head toward the parking lot, toward the highway that went on, lanes like veins. His hat shadow swallowed his eyes. "There's a pull-off past the cattle guard where the wind never stops. The grass there grows in tight circles." Marta dropped a fork. It made a sound like a coin settling. I'm not a superstitious man. I stock condoms and lottery scratchers and believe the coffee works because it's hot and bitter, not because of any blessings. But I had grown up on 50 miles of stories. Men in hats who didn't age, a truck that passed with no driver dragging chains, a white dog that ran alongside you no matter how fast you drove. I'd laughed at all of that when I left for 2 semesters of junior college, and I'd laughed when I came back to take over nights after my father's second heart attack, laughing to keep from counting what I'd lost. But standing there under the neon with the pie gone soft and the man's coffee steaming like breath, the stories moved in me like fish rearranging in the dark. The deputy came in with the dust of 100 roads on his boots and a polite way of looking that said so much without saying. He checked the bathrooms again, walked the lot, peeked under the trailers like the girls could be hiding between axles. I pointed out their backpacks. He found a sketchbook in one and a phone charger in the other and nothing else. "Any cameras?" he asked me. "One over the register," I said, and it was true, but it was a dummy we'd put up after a string of dine and dashes. I felt something like heat behind my ears. The man in the hat left while we were going over who'd come in that night and who had left. No bell rang on the door. No voices said goodnight. The stool where he'd been sitting did a slow half-turn and stopped, and the mug on the counter was empty, and the pie had an exact wedge missing like someone had measured it with math. I don't know how I missed him moving. The deputy rubbed his jaw and told me sometimes girls change their mind and go with someone at the last minute, and forget to take their things and come back later embarrassed. "We'll make a report," he said. "You've got my number." After he left, Marta said, "You know him?" "No," I lied, because that felt safer than all the ways I sort of did. We locked the backpacks in the office. When I turned the bolt, it clicked like a small bone breaking clean. We worked until dawn. The sun lightened the top edge of the sign before pages of pink ripped across the horizon like someone had opened a wound. Trucks pulled in, drivers blinking from night, ordering eggs and coffee and talking about distances with a tired joy. I smiled and nodded and sold scratchers, though I avoided looking into the spoon bin because each oval reflection showed a hat brim, and I didn't like that. By noon, the girls had names and people who were calling to ask if we'd seen them. By evening, the county's Facebook page had their faces, one smiling big with braces like little fences, the other ducking her head and looking up with the scar flexed white. By midnight, 3 men told me they'd seen a pair who could be them at a picnic area, and none of the 3 stories matched. I heard the man in the hat's voice in all of it. Lots of traffic. Hard to keep track. 3 nights later, a woman in a red windbreaker came in and ordered coffee and left her wallet open on the counter while she dug for change. The man in the hat was there again, 2 stools down, stirring again, eyes in the shadow again. He wasn't older. He wasn't younger. He was what he was. Brown coat that had been expensive once, boots stained with something that wasn't oil, a ring on his right hand that looked cheap and not. He turned his head a degree toward the woman's wallet, then toward the door, then put his spoon down and stood. It wasn't the movement that stuck with me. It was the way the air seemed to cinch around the shape of him, like his outline had rules. He walked to the door. The woman followed 20 seconds later, carrying her coffee, saying, "Sir, you forgot your—" And I did. I came around the counter and into the aisle and I said her ma'am as fast as I could. but the door shuddered and my mouth filled with the taste of copper like I'd been to the dentist. I pushed outside into the kind of night that makes sound fall heavy. The lot was bare except for my own car and a long-nosed Peterbilt with its lights off, and the highway was a ribbon of black that only the wind could see. The woman blinked at me and she said, "He was just..." Then she looked at her coffee and the steam drew a thin line up into the dark and snapped. We found her wallet sitting on the hood of a Buick at Pump 4. The cash was still there. The driver of the Buick, that cattle hauler with the broken card, had gone in to fix something with the cashier at the fuel desk and came out and found the wallet and looked up and the neon buzzed and he shrugged and put it down like he wanted no part of anything. The woman left in a hurry, saying thank you too many times. Marta closed early that night and put a carton of eggs in her bag like taking a small gift from a god she didn't trust. The girls didn't come back for their backpacks. A week passed, then 2. We put them in the back room next to the boxes of cup lids and the mop heads. I flipped through the sketchbook once when I was bored. It was filled with drawings of roadside places, a gas station canopy with dead tubes, a picnic table with one missing board, the kind of dirt lot where someone had tried to plant a tree and given up. Each drawing had a figure tucked somewhere in it, a tiny hat in a far window, a sliver of a boot heel in a puddle, a smile drawn with 2 lines and no lips. I closed the book and washed my hands in hot water until my skin blushed. The man in the hat kept coming. Not every night, not at predictable times. Sometimes I would look up from refilling napkin dispensers and he'd be there, touching the rim of his mug with his index finger like he was feeling the pitch through the ceramic. Sometimes I would go to the cooler to stock more Gatorade and come back and his stool would be empty, but warm if you set your palm there. I tried to catch his reflection in the Coke machine door when I bent to fish out a fallen bottle, but all I ever saw was myself stretched and thin. I drew little rules for myself because rules make things less frightening, even if the rules are the kind a child might make about monsters in the closet. If he sits by the window, it'll be a quiet night. If he takes his hat off, no one will leave alone. If he eats the pie, call the deputy right then. None of the rules held. He didn't seem touched by the logic of ordinary people. He brought his own weather with him. The neon above the counter would hum louder when he arrived, and the coffee steam would stand straighter, and you could hear the tire squeal from the access road like it was right. Next to your ear, I asked Old Man Rios, who has driven from the border to the cities and back since the 70s, if he remembered anyone who never seemed to get older. Rios took off his cap and wiped his forehead with a bar napkin and said, "You mean like the story?" I said, "What story?" And he blinked slow like a lizard and laughed so it rattled. "Boy," he said to me. And I wasn't a boy then, but men older than you will call you that to steady the table between you. That truck stop has always had a man in a hat. When I was 20, he was 40. Now I'm 70 and he is 40 again. He has a different hat sometimes. "Always the same brim. What does he do?" I asked. Rios looked at the window as if the glass remembered. "He waits until you forget something," he said. "He waits until you fall out of yourself a little bit. Then he asks if you've ever been east." He nodded to himself and said, "You say no." 2 months passed and the county had 3 new billboards with the girls' faces on them and a hotline number that rang into the December cold like a dare. The cafe started selling cinnamon rolls then, because Marta's cousin had a bakery that went under and he needed to unload flour. The rolls made the place smell like a better version of itself. People came just to sit in the sweetness and the warm. I watched them watch the door. When he came in and sat, the smell seemed to back up like steam shrinking. I put his pie down and pushed the fork toward him without looking. Like that could make him human. He said, "Tell me your name, finally." And it was such an ordinary bladed thing that I felt foolish for not expecting it. Names are the handles you give to strangers to carry you by. I told him mine. He said it back to me like he was trying the weight. "You manage nights," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do," I said, and I wiped a circle of clean around his mug. "I grew up here." "You left," he said. And again it wasn't a question. 2 semesters, I said, and I wanted to take the words back suddenly. They felt like coins you realize are rare only after someone has palmed them. He tapped the rim with his spoon. The neon stuttered. A truck out on the access road braked too hard and squealed, and the sound came in long like a belt being pulled through loops forever. "You ever think about the space between the white lines?" he asked. "How it isn't really space. It's road you can't step on. I think about coffee filters, I said. How they smell like paper when they're fresh and a sink when they're done. He said, and his smile didn't move his cheeks again. You and I could be friends, I said nothing. Friendship is a thing you offer, not a thing you announce like weather. That winter, the stories came back hard. A woman with a baby said she had seen a man in a hat, standing at the edge of the lot looking at the highway with his back to the wind and his coat not moving at all. A man whose rig couldn't quite make the grade on Black Mesa said he'd given a lift to 2 girls with thin jackets, and when he stopped for coffee, they hopped out and walked into the dark like they were late for something. A kid with a nose ring said he'd dreamed he was in our bathroom and every stall door was his own face. I had my own nights where I woke up in the little apartment above the storage room and listened to the neon flicker on and off through the wall and said my name under my breath to make sure it still fit. The sketchbook called to me in those hours like a radio left on in another room. I would unlock the office and slide it out and turn the pages without turning them, looking at the pencil lines like the tracks of something in the dust. In the last quarter of the book, the drawings got simpler. Fewer trees, fewer picnic tables, more straight lines, more long stretches of nothing. There were small notes in the margins, mm614, mm619. The last page was just a horizon. In the bottom corner, a shape like a hat brim. In the middle of the page, so faint I had to tilt it toward the Coke machine light, a curve like the top of a head seen from behind and below. I started looking east myself when I took breaks. Past the cattle guard where the grass did grow in circles, I found the pull-off. It wasn't much. 2 trash barrels, a sign that said, "Don't litter please," like it was asking a favor. The wind there had a way of making your eyes water without your permission. The grass lay down in one direction like someone had brushed it with a giant's hand. I stood there and tried to think what kind of person you'd have to be to take someone from a cafe without anyone noticing. I realized I was asking the wrong question. The better question was, what kind of place do you need to make a person vanish? A place where the rules are already thin. A place where the floor is so clean your reflection doesn't stick. I took to walking the lot every hour, even if no one was fueling. Even if it meant the fryer timer would scream and nobody would shut it up but me. I found little things I'd never noticed. A penny embedded in tar near pump 6, a pattern of drips on the concrete that repeated like a stamp, a dead moth wedged into a seam with its dust still perfect. I found that if I stood by the far edge and looked back at the cafe, the neon made a square around the window that turned everyone inside into a kind of aquarium. I found that if you watched long enough, you could see yourself moving behind the glass like a different life. One night, a storm came in from the east with the kind of lightning that writes its name on your eyelids. We lost power in a blink and the generator coughed itself awake, and the cafe lights came back but a shade dimmer, like a copy of a copy. The man in the hat was there. He set his spoon down perfectly flat and said, "This is a good night," I said. "For who?" And he glanced toward the door. A woman came in soaked to the hips, hair plastered to her face, holding one shoe by the strap. She said she'd hit something on the highway that wasn't a deer. She said she needed a phone. I handed her the cordless and watched the way her hands shook in 2 different rhythms, one fast from the cold, one slow from remembering. She couldn't get someone to answer. The lines in the storm were a mess. She held the phone to her chest like a small animal and sat down 2 stools from him. He didn't look at her. He looked at the reflection of her in the stainless steel napkin holder. I tried to stand closer without making a show of it. The storm slapped rain against the glass and the neon sizzled, and for a second I smelled something hot and metallic, and I thought about the way metal heats under a welder's arc. He said, "Bad night," like he was making conversation. She nodded and swallowed and said, "I don't want to be alone." And that sentence went into the air and hung there, and the cafe could not process it. Not with our fryers and our sugars and our lists. He turned his head a degree and the brim shadowed her fingers. "Ma'am," I said softly, and I don't know why I called her that when she was maybe 25. "Can I get you eggs?" I asked, as if eggs could be a kind of talisman. She laughed at me and then apologized, and I saw then that laughing was her way of keeping her teeth from chattering. He said to me without turning his head, "You're very kind," and there was no tone to it at all, so I could hear any tone I wanted. I scrambled the eggs too fast and burnt them a little, and she ate them anyway like they were medicine. The storm went on, slapping the glass, and I watched the reflection in the napkin holder. and in the reflection the hat moved closer to her by a fraction, though when I looked directly at them they were the same distance apart. "Have you ever been east?" he asked her gentle. My mouth was full of a word, and that word was no, and I could not seem to get it out of my throat. The cafe hummed and the fryer ticked as it cooled, a sound like someone thinking. She set down her fork and a piece of egg stuck to the tines and swung there. "I think I have," she said, which wasn't an answer at all. The power flinched again, and in the dark fraction between generator breath and neon relight, I heard a door hinge whine, but no door. The lights came back. The stool where she sat turned a half-inch. Her shoe lay on the floor like it had fallen in slow motion. The man in the hat's coffee had a ripple on it like someone had exhaled across the surface. The cook in the back yelled that the freezer alarm had started for no reason. Marta was off that night and the counter felt wrong without her small, certain motions. I picked up the shoe and set it on the stool. I said, "One, ma'am," to the air like a fool. The storm ratcheted down in stages. The fryer hiccuped. The generator idled lower, the pitch smoothing. The man in the hat pushed the pie at me with 2 fingertips. "It's not fresh," he said. "And I thought it was fresh enough for you a second ago." I called county. I sounded like I was trying to talk through a scarf. The deputy on duty said he'd send someone when the road opened 2 miles north. I set the shoe on the counter and I kept wiping the same clean circle until the rag dried in my hand. There are ways a place can hold a shape even after the shape is gone. The cushion of that stool had a small depression, thumb-sized, and I kept expecting to see a raindrop in it, a proof of her body. The napkin holder showed me a reflection of empty that looked like a reflection of full. I could picture her walking under the brim of his hat, like the shade was the only dry path through the room. When the deputy came, he looked at the shoe and at me and at the camera dome above the register that was still a lie. He put the shoe in an evidence bag like it was a bird. He said, "You should put in real cameras," and I said, "We will," and I meant it. Promises are easy in a storm. When daylight came, the owner said the cost was wrong and the dummy was good enough for a place like this. I started to see the hat where it wasn't. In the curved chrome of the coffee urn, in the slick dark of the turned-off flat top, in the window of my own car when I locked up at 4 and tried to sleep upstairs while the mop bucket dripped, drip, drip into its hole. I told myself that noticing was a kind of defense. If I could see him everywhere, then where he actually was would be less dangerous. That was more child logic, like the closet rule. Spring arrived early that year. The mesquite decided all at once to go green like it remembered how. The yardman dragged the dead tumbleweeds out from under the sign and burned them, and the smoke rolled across the lot and up to the highway and made the brake lights look like eyes. A high school kid in a Letterman jacket came in with flowers and left with cinnamon rolls, the good ones from the middle of the tray, and I wanted to tell him to pick a different place to meet his date. Instead, I sold him the rolls and told him to take napkins. The man in the hat was there that night, nearer to the window than usual, and I had the sensation that his hat brim was a sort of line drawn where the air thinned. Rios died that spring, not on the road but in a recliner in his niece's trailer, and I went to the funeral because I knew he would have come to mine. The church basement coffee was sweet and weak. I looked for the hat in corners on coat racks. I imagined him paying respects politely, saying he was a good man, and no one remembering him later, only a remembered shadow where a hat might have hung. There's a thing you learn, working nights. You learn that the end comes bright. Not just in lights, though there are always too many lights when something ends, but in attention, as if the world concentrates for 1 second to carve the moment hard into you. That's how my last night at 621 felt. The air clear after a rain. The neon solid, no hum at all. The coffee so sharp it felt like it could cut. I was 1 week out from turning the keys over to a new manager who'd driven in from the city. The kind of man who doesn't know yet that the mop water smells different at 3 a.m. than it does at 3 p.m. The girls. Billboard had faded a shade, but their eyes still followed you south. I felt him before I saw him. A pressure, a weightedness to the shape of the room. I turned and there he was at the counter, hat brim low, spoon in hand. He didn't look at me. He looked at the window where the highway wrote itself into the distance. I set down the pie and the mug. I didn't speak. I watched the way the steam fingered up and then straightened under a draft I could not feel. "Have you ever been east?" he asked, and it was the first time he'd aimed it right at me. I said no. and the relief I felt hearing my own voice firm was like swallowing ice water in July. He waited. The kind of waiting that adds a ring to a tree. "There's a pull-off past the cattle guard," he said, as if helping me. "I know it," I said. His smile creased his cheeks this time. It didn't make him look kinder. It made him look like a picture of a man smiling. He lifted his mug and blew across the surface, a slow, patient breath. I felt that breath on the back of my neck as if he'd stood behind me to do it. The coffee did not ripple. Marta was off that night. The cook was a kid I didn't know yet who had not learned how to slice onions without weeping. A woman I'd seen twice that week sat at the end of the counter with a road atlas, folding and refolding it like it could be made smaller by effort. A driver in a camouflage cap counted out quarters for the shower. A teenage boy with a backpack picked at a hangnail until it bled and then sucked on it, eyes flat with the pain. Every one of them breathed. Every one of them had a name that someone would say if they went missing. I looked at the man in the hat and felt an old, stubborn thing rise in me like a man stands up in his own house. "You pay?" I said, and slid the check toward him. He tilted his head, a movement of the brim like a sundial. "You never pay," I said, and it came out more like a prayer than I wanted. You take and you leave and I clean around what you took and I tell myself work is work. "But you pay." He set the spoon on the napkin and its bowl left a wet oval. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and I was, for the first time since childhood, truly afraid. Not of a person, but of a rule I did not understand. He took out, not a wallet, but a small stack of those paper rectangles restaurants use to separate pies in a box. He set them on the counter and fanned them. Each had a number in pencil in the corner. 614, 619, 621, 623. "What is this?" I asked, already knowing. "Tabs," he said. "You run a place, you know tabs." "I don't," I said. He put his finger on the one with 621. "You saw me this night," he said, and his voice was as flat as the pie paper. "And this and this." He tapped 614 and 619. "When the wind was high, when the neon snapped, when the fryer sang." "That's not how this works," I said, and my voice wanted to break and didn't. He pushed the 621 slip toward me with absolute gentleness. "You're right," he said. "You run me a bill. For what?" "For what you keep." I looked around the cafe at the ketchup bottles, the dollar store clock that had been stuck at 2:11 for a year, the pictures on the wall of our opening day, men with thick mustaches and women with bangs, and the first owner standing like he'd built the highway himself. I looked at the shoe behind the counter. I thought of the sketchbook. I thought of the grass by the pull-off, the circles pressed into it like something had settled and lifted again without touching. I picked up the 621 slip and wrote a number. It was wrong. It would always be wrong. I slid it back. He glanced and nodded as if I'd said grace. He stood, the brim shaving a slice of air as he moved. He set his ringed finger to the hat's crown, just a touch to keep it steady in the door's small wind, and he walked out into the night that looked exactly like any other. I went to the window. The neon drew that aquarium square around my face. In the glass I saw shapes that could have been anything. Taillights, lightning too far away to hear, the gleam of an aluminum trailer, the white of a road line not reflecting right. I pressed my palm to the pane and the glass held my heat. And in that heat I saw a hat brim wavering and I told myself it was mine. The deputy stopped by it too to say the county had finally installed cameras at the rest stops. "Progress," he said. And we both looked at the ceiling dome over the register and didn't say anything about it being dead. "You doing okay?" he asked. "Sure," I said. "I'm leaving next week, yeah?" He said, surprised, like I was a post that wouldn't pull. "Going where?" "East," I said, and I didn't mean it like he meant it. I meant a town with a college and a job stocking a different kind of shelf. I meant a place with a new neon that would hum in a fresh way. He clapped my shoulder. He bought a cinnamon roll and left with it in a napkin, steam making the bag spot. The man in the hat did not come back that night. He did not come the next. The new manager arrived and stood with his hands on his hips the way men do when they want to look like they're measuring. I showed him the freezer alarm and the trick with the pump receipts and how the bathroom keys like to walk off, and you have to tie something embarrassing to them to keep them home. I did not tell him about the hat. You do not hand that to someone and expect them to carry it right. The girls' backpacks were still in the office. I took the sketchbook on my last day and put it in a paper bag without telling anyone, which was a kind of theft, and I know it. I drove east with the bag on the passenger seat, the highway talking to my tires. I passed the pull-off and looked, and the grass lay flat in 3 circles like seats someone had saved with their jacket. I didn't stop. I drove until the air smelled different, less like hot pennies, more like rain left in a bucket. On my first night in the new town, I could not sleep. The silence of not having the neon under my wall made the dark feel too clean. I took the sketchbook out and flipped to the last page. That faint curve on the horizon had sharpened while it sat in the bag. No pencil had touched it, but it was bolder. It was a hat brim seen from below, as if I lay on my back by the shoulder and watched the sky. Under it, the thin suggestion of a smile. I closed the book and lay there and listened to a refrigerator hum in a tone that wasn't ours, and the sound still tucked the night in a particular way. And I thought about the coffee steam and the neon, and those exact little motions that make up the carousel of working nights. I thought how the man in the hat never ate the rolls no matter how fresh. I thought how he said tabs. I thought how names are handles. I opened my mouth to say my own name to the empty room just to keep it warm, and I heard behind it a second name, said like the first time someone tries it in their mouth to see if it fits. I didn't turn on the light. I watched the dark like it was a window, and I was trying to catch the reflection of a brim in it. Outside, far off, a truck shifted gears, and the sound stretched across the night in a line so thin you could thread anything on it. The curve on the page hung in my head. The circles in the grass turned slow as if something very heavy had just gotten up. And there, in the thin seam between my breath leaving and returning, I felt a small wind move across my face as if someone had blown gently on a cup of coffee to cool it. And I knew the cafe light would always find me, wherever I went, drawing its square around my reflection, keeping me inside. The first sign that I'd taken a bad job came before dawn, when the road turned from cracked asphalt to rutted dirt, and my headlights kept picking the same pair of trees, like the woods had put them on a lazy Susan and spun them past me again and again. I killed the radio because the last station I got was just fizz, and the fizz felt like whispering if you let it. Miller Creek Outfitters had hired me to check their off-season rentals. One caretaker down with a busted pelvis and winter rates low enough to tempt anyone behind on rent. My name's Reed, 41, semi-skilled at everything and good at lists. My first route was a handful of cabins on the north side of the lake. Loose hinges, frozen pumps, windows shy of their frames. I could handle a pump. It was people I was less sure about. The Crockett cabin sat at the end of a spur with a name I could never say with a straight face. Bois d'Ange Lane, hand-painted on a slanted board. The map taped to my clipboard called the place 2-bed, 1 bath, propane, pump cold, bring your own linens, and then, in smaller handwriting, last seen, family of 4, October. No one at the office had mentioned that line. Orrin, my manager, all beard and ball cap, a man who shook hands like he was checking your pulse, just said, "Give it a once-over, lock it down. Note anything that'll cost me money come spring." I parked by a stump that looked freshly chewed and stepped into air that tasted like pennies. The quiet had weight. No chickadee scold, no squirrel knocking on bark. Just the scrape of my boots and my own breath sounding guilty for being there. The cabin itself was a plain, square box with a porch that leaned the way a tired man leans on a bar. The windows were dark, the kind of dark that keeps its own heat. The key box fought me. I cracked a knuckle getting it open and bled a neat red line down my wrist. The deadbolt turned with a sound like a file on a tooth. Inside, the smell hit first. Stale coffee, cold grease, wet wool, something coin metal under it all. The switch by the door gave me nothing, so I unhooked the propane lantern, bled the valve, and coaxed the mantle into a dusty bloom. Light puddled in the kitchen and pushed the corners back an inch or two. That's all you ever get from light in a place like that, an inch or two. The kitchen stopped me. 4 paper plates were set at the table, each with 2 pancakes laid like careful hands. Not cold pancakes, not fossil discs. There was a skin of steam lifting off them, visible in the lantern's breath. Syrup sat in rings like amber left to think. Forks lay where people put them without thinking too hard. One skewed toward the edge the way a kid forgets and gets told not to. A cheap aluminum griddle on the stove held the last pancake stuck in the middle like a coin. The burner below it was off, but the griddle still wore a sheen of heat. I called, "Miller Creek Maintenance." My voice borrowed the room and gave it back smaller. No answer. I held my palm over the nearest plate. Warmth came up, gentle and new. I pulled my hand back because touching a stranger's breakfast is a kind of stealing. At the sink, 4 paper cups weighted with black coffee lines scummed at their middles. Someone had half rinsed them and then stopped. The faucet coughed rust and then ran a cold so clean it hurt my finger joints. I walked the hall saying the rooms out loud to keep the quiet from saying them first. 2 beds, I said, because the sheet on my clipboard had promised. The first room had a double with a quilt stitched from shirt squares, faded logos turned into geometry. The second had bunks, the mattresses thin as truths you tell to keep a kid calm. The lower bunk on the left was kicked free of its tuck in a guilty hurry. A crate between the bunks held a lamp with a crooked shade and a paperback with the corner turned down like a tongue. In the bathroom, a travel toothpaste stood on its head, and a pink hair tie hugged the base of the faucet like a ring that didn't fit anymore. I took photos for the report. Stove, sink, table, windows, floor, chairs, overall. Oren likes overall. Pictures you can use when someone calls in spring and claims a burn mark was always there. I kept waiting for a note to jump into existence. We ran out. Back soon. People who leave pancakes hot leave notes. There wasn't a note. There were 4 coats on the stand by the door. 2 adult, 2 kid. A little windbreaker with reflective stripes that would pop under headlights. A tiny mitten in the sleeve like a spider in a bottle. The neighbors. The folder told me, were a retired couple named the Wexlers in cabin 12. Year-round renters for the sake of the dogs and the air. Oren had said, if you get turned around, look for the yard with the whirligigs. I locked the Crockett and took the spur back until the trees opened. The Wexlers' place announced itself with homemade inventions. A rooster made from a gas can, tin men kicking, a sunflower whose blades were spoons. 3 mutts lifted their heads in a practiced chorus and then decided I didn't matter. Mrs. Wexler came out wiping her hands on a towel as if she'd just taken something out of the oven. Small woman, strong hands, hair pinned into a decision. You must be the new hand, she said. I told her where I'd been. Her face went in around the mouth first. You went in there? She asked, like I'd tracked something holy across her floor. They were a nice family, she said, when I didn't fill the silence with clever. October folks, 2 kids. The girl had a gap tooth. She asked if our rooster was a robot. She gave a light laugh that turned to water in her eyes and then dried itself. We saw their car. Heard a grill lid slam. Then nothing. Sheriff? I said. She nodded. Came out, took pictures, walked in circles. Pancakes were still steaming when we checked. It ain't possible, a thing like that. Not unless time can fold up and put you in its pocket. She looked at my hands. I realized I was rubbing the cracked knuckle like it had spoken to me. You be careful, she said. Sometimes a house remembers for you. On the way back, I noticed something I should have seen. My tire tracks were the only marks in that lane. No deer slots, no fox chain, no drag where a branch fell and got pulled. We hadn't had snow, and wind erases with a different hand. The woods pressed in without sound. The more you stare at quiet, the more you hear your circulation argue with your heartbeat. The lantern hissed back to life when I opened the door again. The kitchen was itself. Plates, syrup, that faint gauze of steam like breath on a mirror. I held my hand over a pancake and didn't lie to myself. Still warm, maybe warmer. I took the plates to the sink like a waiter at close. When the first stream of water hit the griddle, the cabin made a sound not in the walls but under my boots. A plank deep groan like someone easing themselves as far as their body would allow. Okay, I said to no one, which is another way to speak to yourself. I dug in the trash by the door, found a torn note in 2 tidy halves, matched them. Left 20 in the jar for wood. Thank you. Assumed the last name was gone with the other half. I looked for the jar and found 2 mason jars on the highest shelf. Shoulders dusted, bottoms clean. No bills. I called Oren and got his voicemail. Crockett. Pancakes warm. No forced entry. Coats by door. I'll wait a while. Call me. Waiting inside a place that wants you gone is different from waiting anywhere else. The porch chairs looked like traps for backs. I swallowed coffee from my thermos and it tasted like someone had wiped a floor with it. I walked the perimeter, slow and patient, no prints. The ground held old needles, a flash of mica. Frost-stiff moss that tried to remember green. The pump by the corner gave a steel cough when I primed it. The honest sound steadied me. We love the things that explain themselves. Inside, the light felt an hour later without the sky agreeing. I scribbled on my clipboard like a man rehearing his own voice. Kitchen, deep clean. Dining, wipe down, check propane alarm. My pen looked like it had been taught to make words but not to mean them. On an older page, darker with handling, the small handwriting again. Noon? Just the one word followed by a question mark that dug the paper like a heel. I checked my cheap watch. 11:36. The pancakes breathed a ghost. Noon got into my head and sat down. One sensible thing, I told myself. Wash the plates, lock up, tell the office to send a real crew. I boiled water because the hot tap was a rumor. Steam fogged my glasses. Behind the fog, something shifted. By the time I wiped the lenses on my sleeve, the room was itself again. I washed 2 plates. The third had a child's bite out of its pancake, a neat crescent where small teeth meet. I knew that bite without meaning to, knew the size of the mouth. The 4th plate wasn't on the table anymore. I looked at the photo I'd just taken. 4 plates, 4 forks, 1 skewed. I looked at the table. 3 plates. 1 fork lay bent a little outward like a smile trying to happen. I hadn't bent it. The lantern hissed, tender and constant. The pump outside counted something I couldn't hear the numbers of. My breath turned into a thing I had to manage with my hands on the counter. At the window above the sink, I lifted the blind with 2 fingers. The yard was the yard. Stump ruts my car with its windows full of woods. The glass gave me the room back as a double. My shoulder, the lantern, the table with 3 plates. While I watched, the far left chair eased back a whisper. I turned around fast and it was exactly where it belonged, obedient furniture. You learn the difference between a noise you make and a noise that finds you living alone. The next sound wasn't me. It came from under the sink first, a soft rub like a wet thumb on wood. Then behind the stove, then in the hall. Not footsteps, they announce. This was someone moving past hanging coats with patience. It reached the door and didn't try the knob. It let itself be near. My scalp felt like a field when wind decides to lie down in it. "Hey," I said, like you say when you want the moment to pass as a moment and not become a fact. I put my palm to the door. The wood was warm with a warmth that belongs to backs. Noon arrived like a puddle freezing, quiet and all at once. My watch stepped into 12 Aushire and held the shape. The lantern flared and settled. The room tightened, the way a belt tightens when you breathe wrong. The steam off the last pancake rose in a straight thread. When I set my thermos down, the table made a second sound, as if remembering what a thermos sounded like and wanting to agree. I lifted it and set it down twice more and got 1 extra thud each time, out of step and certain. I put the plates back on the table where they'd been because washing the scene felt like scrubbing a sender off a letter you hadn't read. The bent fork straightened without a hand. I heard 2 chairs scrape just enough to let someone stand. "Where are you?" I asked, because sometimes you owe the air the dignity of a question. The blinds trembled like strings on a bass when a heavy step walks past. A small cough came from the hall, the way kids cough to be noticed without being named. A single wet footprint bloomed on the plank between door and table, size of my palm. I followed it with my eyes and not my feet, because following with your feet makes promises. I am not brave. I am thorough. "I can come back later," I said, and the words fell to the floor like dropped cutlery. A narrow draft came through a house with closed windows and it smelled of shampoo and wool, and a tongue tip of copper like pennies sucked on a dare. It parted around me politely, the way strangers do when they're late for something and don't want to say it. I didn't run. Running teaches a place how to chase you. I backed to the door, keys ready, clipboard tight to my chest. Outside, the lane felt new and older at once. My car started like it wanted to be a different kind of object than a car. I looked in the mirror and saw the kitchen window, and in the window a blur that was exactly the right height to be a girl with a gap tooth whose friends had told her not to stare. Oren looked smaller in daylight, a lighthouse seen from the shore. I sat across from him and said the facts as if I were reading to a bored judge. He drummed his fingers and said, "We'll send the sheriff again," but the county was between budgets and favors. He did send me back the next day with a new CO detector and a partner, Cal, who laughed at the wrong parts of stories and wore his jacket open no matter the weather. We went early. 11:30, like a superstition we hadn't agreed on. Cal tapped the door twice with his knuckles as if we were salesmen. The plates were there. No steam. Syrup rings dull. He stuck a finger in one pancake and lifted a tacky sheen and grinned like he'd caught me. "You do this?" "No," I said, which was the truth and not helpful. At 11:58, he said he had to piss and went down the hall, whistling a single line of a tune I didn't know and never wanted to. I stood by the table and counted breaths. The pump outside did a countdown I couldn't translate. At noon, the cabin narrowed, soft and white like gauze draped over a lamp. I said Cal's name and the cabin didn't give it back. The bathroom door opened under my hand like it had been waiting for the right palm. The room inside was empty. Ugly mirror, fish shower curtain, toilet saluting the ceiling. His jacket hung on the hook. His phone lay on top of it, screen dark, hopeful. Between the hall and the kitchen, the air held a damp coin of warmth, rich with fresh pancake when no heat was on. The fourth plate sat where it should, a neat crescent missing. The CO detector in my pocket chirped once like a bird trying the morning. I set the detector on the counter and it blinked green like a toy that thinks it's useful. I said please, and the blind lifted a finger. The chairs slid an inch. The room relaxed again by degrees, a cat taking a spot you warmed. I picked up Cal's jacket. The inside was body warm. In the lining near the hem, a single long hair threaded itself, caught like fishing line. Blonde, too fine to be his. I couldn't decide if finding it was better or worse than not. The deputy on duty, young, jaw like a toolbox, walked the Crockett with the confidence of a man who believes his body will always be the right shape for doorways. The table was clean now. No plates, no rings. The griddle sat oiled and cool. He wrote my name, took my statement, and said maybe Cal had gone for a walk to think about life. People in uniforms are paid to say it'll be fine, even when their eyes tell you they don't know which room they're in. Orrin paid me through Friday like he was buying a blessing. "Don't go back," he said, and then the next morning, "We need the keys." Cal must have had the Crockett set. Check the porch. Folks leave things. He paused just long enough to put every cowardice he possessed in the gap. Be smart. The porch had a stack of junk mail like a shrine, and under it, Cal's ring. The cheap compass fob insisting north was somewhere that disagreed with the trees. I didn't open the door. I stood long enough for the cabin to decide whether it wanted to open for me. It didn't. I took the keys and left because leaving is a kind of prayer too. Nights now, when the hum in the apartment walls sounds like a breath I can't place, I set that ring on my kitchen table and listen for a noon that isn't mine. The metal warms to the room like a living thing. If I close my eyes, I can hear chairs easing back just enough to let someone stand, a fork straightening without a hand, the patient drip of a pump counting something down. When sleep almost takes me, I smell stale coffee freshening into morning, and I hear a small cough in the hall, polite and hopeful. The kind you make when you're ready for everyone to sit, and you're sure this time the pancakes will still be warm.